This conference is part of the global program, which is great. But the program of today will take us a step further. We will look at service design, and I think that's great, because the discussion about accessibility tends to focus too much on persons with disabilities or functional illiteracy. Even the State of Secretary, Raymond Knops, gives that focus in his policy letter at the House of Representatives. So I think this focus should be on easy to use for everybody. And I'm glad we're focusing on that today, because as a citizen or entrepreneur, you should not go to multiple organizations to get an answer to one question or fill in different forms for achieving one goal. So I'm very happy to announce the first speaker, because the government digital service in the United Kingdom is far ahead from us, I think, with service design and working with standards. And Downe will tell us everything about the experiences and what they learned with gov.uk. So please welcome to the stage, give her a big welcome, Downe.
Oh, thank you. So, hi everyone. These lecterns are always so tall. I don't know why no one ever thinks about it, so I should bring my own little box, but I'm just going to stand here so you can see all of me. So hi, it's such a pleasure to be here talking to you all on Global Accessibility Day. I very recently left GDS, and so I'm now going on to do something to do with planning and land transformation in the UK. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about that because I haven't started that job yet, so I don't know anything about it. So I'm going to be talking about the experience that I had when I was Director of Design for the UK just a couple of weeks ago, and some of the things that I've learned, because as Renata was saying, I think a lot of the problems with accessibility and access to government services, or any service really, comes from the way that a service is designed, not just the way that it's built. So really that's been my focus for the last 5 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how we make government services more accessible to everyone. So, as I said, I used to work for the Government Digital Service. Just a show of hands in the room, who has heard of the Government Digital Service? Okay, good. Most of you. Excellent. I don't need to do the full backstory. But in a nutshell, we are an organisation at the heart of the UK government, and we're there essentially to help government to design and build better digital government services. And this is gov.uk. It's the central website for all government services in the UK. We've been around for 7 years now, which is about 6 years older than the average startup, which is interesting. And, you know, really we build the infrastructure for the rest of government to design and deliver better services. So part of my role at GDS was to build the design community, which includes accessibility, user research, and content design. So when we're talking about specifically designers, so interaction designers, service designers, not including user researchers and everyone else, we had, when I started, about 115, which might seem like a lot, but government is big. And so we now have 950 designers as of last year, which is huge. I think that makes us probably the biggest design team in the UK. And we built last year, some of you may have seen this, hopefully some of you are using it because the code is open, you can use it. This is the gov.uk design system, which is the home for all of our design patterns and standards in the UK, so including everything that is accessible from the design patterns to the code itself. We also build a number of kind of common products which help people to deliver services more quickly, so things like gov.uk Pay and Notify, which help people to send and receive text messages and payments within government services. And just last week, we actually changed our digital service standard to the government service standard. So going from what was just a standard for digital services to now a standard that covers the offline elements of a service and the policy of a service. So when we talk about service design, we're really starting to move into those more kind of, I suppose, back-end bits of government services now. So what's next? Probably working out how people use kind of cities and spaces and how digital can kind of enable people to have a better experience of the built environment. But as I said, I don't really know much about that yet, so I'm not going to talk about that. But in the 5 years that I was at GDS, I've learned an awful lot about how to make organizations user-centered, which is really the environment that enables anyone to do anything really that is good for users, be it accessibility or user research. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And really how to scale service design in that environment. I know there's an awful lot of people here from government organizations, but any organization that is big or has lots of services needs to work out how to scale thinking about users at some point. So hopefully this will be relevant for you as well. So, before I start, some ground rules. When people talk about scaling service design or being user-centered in organizations, they often kind of tell you, sort of a lot of things over a very long period of time that are quite obvious. So I'm just going to get them out of the way so we don't have to focus on them. But the first one is there is no formula for being user-centered in an organization. There are many books that will tell you that there are methods, and some of them will work, but most of them are, unfortunately, as far as I found, wrong. Second is everyone is trying to do a good job. It might not feel like it when someone's telling you to do something terrible for users, but no one wakes up in the morning thinking, you know what, I'm just going to make this person's day horrible and I'm going to do a really bad job. There's normally a reason why they don't want to do something. The third one is that breaking out of the cycle of inertia within your organization that means that people don't feel like they can even change is really, really difficult. That's probably one of the most difficult things. But it is possible. There will be lots of people that will tell you that it's not possible. It is, it just takes a really, really long time sometimes and a lot of determination. Spoiler, the hardest part of getting your organization to be user-centered is probably getting it to see itself as a service provider. So this, for some reason, is such a kind of mental shift for so many people that I've realized over the last 5 years, this is the one thing that once people understand they're a service provider, everything else becomes much, much more easy, but this is the hardest part. So when it comes to, kind of the UK government is actually probably the oldest and largest service provider in the UK. It's probably the same actually in the Netherlands, and in most countries, the government is certainly the oldest service provider, if not the largest. This is a good example of this. This man, apart from his most excellent eyebrows, which he was very, very proud of, this is the team that runs the fishing rod licensing service in the UK. And you can tell, I mean, that man runs a fishing rod licensing service, right? But the fishing rod licensing service, aside from helping people to be able to fish in the UK, was in fact one of our oldest services. So it dates back to the time of Henry VIII. You can actually go and see the legislation written on vellum in the archives. It's fascinating, very weird. And it was designed basically for the king to stop people from poaching his fish. So not exactly the most, kind of user-centered motivation. But we now use the money collected from that service to pay for the maintenance of all of our rivers. So a very worthy service. So that service, if you want some context, is probably about 267 years older than America as it was defined as America. It's not the only one of these services. We have about 10,000 services in the UK. You probably have more in the Netherlands. I think, in my experience, there seems to be a scale, size of country, size of services. So we have 10,000, quite small. And we have 25 different departments or ministries, whatever you want to call them, but organizations that provide those services. And about 500,000 people, so about the size of Milton Keynes, if you've ever been to Milton Keynes in the UK. You probably haven't. But this is just a small selection of what our government services look like right now. And you can see we really like acronyms. We like our acronyms to be phonetic as well, so READOR, members, WANs, something that you can kind of rolls off the tongue for the civil servant. But it's probably safe to say that if you were an average user, you wouldn't know if you were trying to learn to drive or start a business, which of these services you should use. And in fact, when I've shown these to civil servants, they don't even recognize some of these services either. And my favorite actually is still the sheep and cattle tracing service, which is called ARAMS. I know, civil servants love a pun, but it's a terrible way of naming services. And it means that really our services were not designed for the internet. Our services were designed for a world that looked like this, where you walked into a government office and that person helped you to do something and you said, I'm trying to start a business, which forms do I need to fill in? And they would say, here is the ARAMS form. And you would be guided through that process. And that's not how services work on the internet anymore. Google is the homepage to all of our services. It's probably the homepage to all of your services as well. And it's where people start. And when people start with Google, essentially they end up with a whole bunch of Google fails for government services. But what they're really looking for are verbs. So very simple things. And when we think about good services, we mean that good services are things that people are trying to do, not names of things that they don't know. So good services are things like learn to drive or become a childminder or get a pension. They're not things that you've just seen like SORN or charity letter forwarding service that you wouldn't know what they were before you started. But if our services were not designed for the internet, then the organization that provides those services was not designed for the internet either. Services in the internet age cross multiple different boundaries. And the problem that we have in the UK is that you can essentially deal with up to 14 different departments for simple services like importing and exporting something or starting a business. And in fact, if you develop a medical condition and have to stop working, you have to interact with 3 different departments to be able to do that. So you're, as a user, being forced into a situation where you have to do the navigation, not us, which is a problem. So how do you scale service design in that environment where you have thousands of services provided by multiple different organizations right across the UK? And we have a much smaller problem in the UK because our location is smaller, but it's still a challenge for us to do that in those different locations. And I think the answer to this, and it's not the only answer, but part of it is really about fundamentally rethinking about how we think about the future and how we think about designing for that potential future. And I want to give you an example of that. So this is possibly what we think of when we think of the future. Kind of flying cars where we drop our children out of it, and it seems like a great idea because obviously that's safe. And I think it's an example of the fact that when we think about the future, we think about this kind of knowable end state where we'll get to it and then everything will be done and then we can all go home. And just this morning I was having a conversation with Renata about a particular website that was accessible and then became not accessible because the one person who was in charge of accessibility there left. And I'm sure that's a very familiar story for most of you here. It's certainly a familiar story for me. So a really good example of how we've approached design for the future in the past, which kind of needs to change, is actually this. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is the logo for British Rail, and it was designed by an organization called the Design Research Unit back in the 1960s and 70s. And when they approached this problem, they really went to town on this, and graphic designers get very excited about this. They actually kickstarted this book just for the logos. Because it's so exciting. But it does look beautiful, and it kind of influenced lots of things, including the way that airports are designed. It looks great on the side of trains. They even made buttons and lapel pins and clocks, and they designed everything. And it still looks great today. But when they started, they actually had a really ambitious plan, and they wanted to kind of recondition and redesign public utility services. Only this is kind of what we think of when we think of public utility services in the UK now. Who has been on a British train? Yes, several. You will recognize this. This is a toilet door. And it's so complicated that you don't just need, basically descriptions and arrows above each of the buttons. You also need a panel on the side to describe how to lock the door. And this is a genuine problem for every user of British trains, is the fear of the door opening while you're sat on the toilet. This is a real fear that we all have deep in the British psyche. It's so complicated and we're so anxious about it now that we have produced YouTube videos to describe to ourselves and visitors how to lock the toilet door. And it's now so much of a joke that we've actually... Just going to leave this here. We've actually, kind of used it in adverts because it's so horrific. I'm going to move that on because it's slightly terrifying. But really, what Design Research Unit did was a prime example of thinking that transformation was about the ability to do one thing and do one thing well, and that to design the way that the trains looked. And they never thought to themselves, oh, wait a second, in kind of 40 years' time, we're going to have electric toilet doors, and someone's going to need to design that. And so part of their plan was never to recruit designers and bring them into that organization. They didn't think that through. So when we think about about transformation in our organizations, or being user-centered, it's really not about the ability of one team to do one thing at one point in time. It's really about the ability of an organization to design and deliver services over time. And not end up in a situation where the toilet doors are so complicated that they need to have YouTube videos about it. So I want to kind of finish on 5 lessons on how to kind of scale service design. These are not the only 5 things. There are more things, and you will have your own things as well. But these are 5 things that I've learned in the last 5 years, 1 per year. The first one is really about what it is that you do and how you work. So the importance of focusing on delivery and not on definitions. One of the most challenging things about doing service design in an environment that isn't really designed for it is that you can often spend an awful lot of your time trying to tell people what it is that you're doing. And I have wasted thousands of hours doing that. My teams have wasted thousands of hours doing that. And in the end, it's not important. The most important thing is showing what you've done. Back when we started GDS, there was a kind of a period where we went out and we asked the different executive directors of different companies, and we said, how do you get stuff done? What is it that stopped you from transforming your organization? And they said, essentially, they spent too much time focusing on the strategy and not enough on actually delivering stuff and just getting on and doing things. So this forever has kind of been our strategy, is to deliver. And I want to give you an example of this. This is a government processing center in Croydon, but it could be anywhere in the world, because most government processing centers look like this, packs of paper spilling over in every direction. And this is actually the processing center for Chinese visas. You can see that these piles of paper are larger than they should be because they include this. This is a HOKU, or household register. And in China, it's a really important document because you can't get a house, you can't send your children to school, you can't get a pension without one of these. And it's one of about 14 different documents that people in China will send to the UK in order to get their visa to come and stay here or work or to study. And speaking to the people who actually kind of run this service, this is their list of things that they expect to receive. But when you ask them what they actually need in order to make a decision, it's these 5 things, and not the HOKU at all. So you don't actually need to send it to us. So what the team did was to remove this, and they said very clearly on the beginning of the service, please only send us these documents. Please don't send us these other documents. So a very tiny little change to the service. And they managed to reduce the paper applications to that one service by 25%, which might not seem like a lot, but when you think about 25% spread across every single paper processing center, just of additional documentation that people don't need to send us, that's a lot of stuff. And what it ultimately meant was that they then got approval to be able to recruit a design team straight off of the back of that project, not through explaining what service design was and not through trying to help people to understand why they were doing things, but just by getting on and doing it. So it really is one of the most important things, is to just go on and do something and not worry about what you call yourself. Are you UX designer, a UI designer, or this or that, to just do some stuff. So I don't know how familiar you are with service design, but service design is often kind of seen as a lot of different things, process ideologies, new word for UX. In reality, service design is very simple. Service design is the design of services. I know it seems revolutionary, but there you are. It's strangely controversial in some places, but there we go. So the next thing is really that good design teams don't happen by accident. You know, I think we all know this in our hearts. You know, when we're working in a good environment, we understand that it's because someone has made space for us to be able to do that really great work. But when it comes to recruiting design and understanding how it should be funded within our organizations, we often forget that. And we think that, you know, we just recruit the people and then they'll be able to do great work. And that's not how it happens. So like I said, in 2015, we had 115 designers. Last year, we had 950. And that happened as a direct result of the fact that we have regular community events, people coming together to share knowledge, much like this, share their common problems. And we train roughly about 10,000 people every year, not just designers, user researchers, accessibility experts, but people who are in policy and operations in those skills so that they understand how to work with those people in their teams as well. And we hold about 30 community events every year. This was one of our open ones that we did with the public in the Design Museum in London, which was very cool. And I think it really comes down to the fact that actually when you design your operations, you need to design them as well as the service that those designers are trying to provide. Because ultimately they need to kind of be able to work and do their job. So having things like consistent job descriptions, having equal pay across different areas of the country, all of those things are the boring back-end bits, which ultimately was my job, but are so, so important to be able to get those designers from 115 to 950. But the most important thing about that is not how many designers you have, but how they work. And actually making sure that rather than having them working in a lab where no one understands what they're doing, having them working embedded within teams so that not only can they be designing great stuff, but they can be helping to sort of share the message and spread the word about why the thing they're doing is important as well. Because ultimately, everyone in your organization owns the user experience, right from the person who does recruitment of people who work on the phones to, you know, the UX designer who is working on how something kind of works for a user. Everyone has an effect on that end service. And ultimately, we have a kind of mantra, certainly in the UK, that making things open makes it better, that helping people to share their work, being embedded in the team, is actually part of the work, and you need to make space and time for that to happen. So that's what we did. We made sure that there was a direct shared objectives across the entire 950 designers in the UK to actually share their work and worked with people who weren't like themselves in their team to basically spread what they were doing, which was cool. So this next kind of point is maybe a little bit conceptual, but really about how we think about designing for that kind of future state. So rather than trying to design the future, what we should be focusing on is actually designing something that can be designed and iterated as the future changes. And I think a really good example of this is actually, so this is taken several years ago. You can see this is a very old Fitbit plugged into an Apple charger, then plugged into a European converter in Switzerland. And it's never designed to do this, but in a way it was, because that's what standards do, and that's what standards help you to be able to do in the future. Take an old piece of technology, plug it into a newer piece of technology, and then into something that was never designed even to kind of accommodate something like that. And you know, that's what we've done with the GovUK design system. And the GovUK design system is not a static object. It's designed as a set of standards that can be used and iterated and changed over time, but ultimately mean that when we have services that are shared across multiple different departments, they can look and feel as if they are one service, and they can be as interoperable as those plugs were in the wall. And this design system includes everything from, like you can see, date inputs and things that are very simple to things that are much, much more complicated and more policy focused, like how do you talk about sex and gender in a service? And really, actually, those design systems only work as well as the designers contributing to it. So thinking back to building your design team, this is really the kind of the product of that well-functioning design team, is that they can work together to create something like the GovUK design system. And you can see this was my inbox, and I wasn't doing too well, 184 unread emails. But this is just an example of the kind of daily threads. We had about 5 different new threads every day on a mailing list for designers across the UK government. So beyond that 950, I think we had about 3,000 people signed up to this mailing list. And that was used for everything from asking questions about how to create a pattern or wondering if anyone had already created something. And people would sort of start different user groups to look at certain areas, so things like looking at casework on this very simple mailing list. Ultimately, we didn't have universal access to things like Slack across government, so email was probably the best way of doing it. But actually, being able to collaborate on those patterns is a privilege. It's not something that kind of comes to everyone. And where we should not expect design teams to work functionally together without effort from ourselves, we shouldn't expect people to be able to collaborate across different organizational boundaries without support as well. And we really shouldn't expect that to kind of happen on its own. In the UK government, about 65% of our services stretch across multiple different organisational boundaries, which shows you just how much the structure of our government was not designed to meet user needs. But that's a longer-term problem that we can't fix by just merging different departments. It just doesn't work like that. So we've needed to come up with a different approach to how we approach change and iterating those services across different organisational boundaries and supporting people to be able to do that. And we found that the biggest barriers to actually collaboration across borders is exactly as you would find the barriers to a lot of things in our daily lives. And they are things like having access to shared budget. So if I work in Department A and you work in Department B, and we want to work on something, we have different budgets feeding the things that we're doing. We have different motivations. Also time, so being able to be given the permission and time by your boss is not something that everyone has, and not everyone has the ability to be able to say, you know what, screw you all, I'm going to do it anyway, because that is something we're not all able to do. And then access to data, so being able to share data about users across different organizational boundaries is a real challenge, and most of it because of misunderstanding of what the law actually says, and it's not as restrictive as often people think. So often enabling that collaboration means giving people the privilege, so giving people that money and time and permission to be able to work together. And that's exactly what we have done. We've helped people to share money, time, and permission to work together. And ultimately kind of creating a new structure to government, which is, sounds like, I feel a bit odd talking about this to UK civil servants because they start kind of thinking, oh my goodness, what are they doing? But it's actually, what we're doing in this space is very subtle. We've created a set of teams that work across different departments as if they were one department. And so we've created a central budget line for them, we've created a new governance structure for them, and it helps them to feel like they have the permission to be able to work together. So the sort of ones that we're working on at the moment are import-export, start a business and employ someone, and we'll be moving out to other cross-government services shortly after as well. But ultimately, this approach is bigger than just in the UK, right? So when you look at a lot of the services that governments provide, here in the Netherlands as well, most of them kind of are very similar to each other, and not really surprisingly. And they are we're focusing on things around aging and immigration, pollution and waste, accessibility, of course, and also, giving people permission and licenses to be able to do stuff. And this is why we last year founded the International Design in Government organization, which any of you are free to join. If you work for the public service and you're interested in design, please do. If you Google that and then GDS, you'll find a link to join it. And we have now 2,000 members in 87 countries. I think there's several people from the Netherlands already, which is awesome. And the way that they work is essentially by taking those different topics, taking a topic like pollution and waste, and bringing together the different designers working in different countries on those things to contribute to shared patterns. because ultimately there are things that, although our services work in unique ways, we can learn and we can not have to do more than once if we work together. Last year we had a really awesome conference, and this year we're having 3 actually, one in Rotterdam, one in the US, and one in Scotland. So if you fancy coming along to any of those, please do. The tickets are still available, I think. But I think all of those things are, you know, kind of great in and of themselves, and they are incredibly important to kind of get right. But I think probably the most foundational thing is really understanding what we mean by a good service. Because unless you have that shared understanding in your organization, everyone is going to be headed in different directions. And I am always infinitely surprised when someone brings to me this most terrible looking thing and they say, look, it looks great. And it's almost like you're looking at 2 completely different things, because you see something that clearly would never work and that person is utterly in love with this horrible looking thing. So having a shared sense of what we mean by good is incredibly important. And I think it combats this. I'm never quite sure how well this metaphor works in different languages, but I'll give it a go. So in the UK we have this phrase about headless chickens. And it kind of means someone who is just doing something for no particular reason, but just because they're doing it automatically. In the UK, certainly delivery is that thing, and just the pace of delivery and making sure that you deliver on time, on target. Even if you're in an agile environment, delivery can sometimes be the thing that is just pushing you to make terrible decisions unnecessarily. Here is a headless chicken, apologies. You know what, it's funny. I showed that picture to a US audience, and I've never seen more shocked faces. I think different cultural understandings of how okay that is. But anyway, let's move on. So really what this comes down to is actually this idea that actually technology is about what can be done in your organization. And that can be a really powerful driving force of possibilities and new ideas. But really it's the job of design to take those set of opportunities and to be able to say, okay, well, what should we be doing? And what we should be doing is actually building good services. So having a shared sense of what it is should be done is incredibly important. And as designers and as people working on services, we need an answer to this question of what do we mean by a good service? So apologies for the terrible contrast on this. The cover has not been designed yet properly. It says good services. And then at the bottom it says my name. And it's because it's a book. It's out in November. And apologies, I am doing that thing where you get on a stage and you say, I'm writing a book, go buy my book. But it's not finished yet. So if you do have ideas on what you think a good service is and you'd like to contribute ideas to it, please do. I'm really welcome to kind of hear your ideas. You can join a mailing list here to kind of understand more about it and also contribute. That would be awesome. And slides are not available there, but they will be available later. But thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think we